The alarm screamed through Station 19 at 11:47 p.m. on Friday night, and Captain Jake Morrison knew something was wrong before his boots hit the firehouse floor. In 23 years of fighting fires in Manhattan, he'd developed an instinct for danger that had saved more lives than he could count, and right now, that instinct was telling him this wasn't just another false alarm at Nexus Tower. The pristine glass monument to corporate power had never called in an emergency before, but as Jake's crew raced through the empty streets toward Wall Street, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited in that 87-story tower would change everything he thought he knew about America. The dispatch had been routine: smoke detector malfunction on the 67th floor of the Nexus Corporation building. But as Engine 19 pulled up to the gleaming fortress of steel and glass, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Every single window was dark except for one floor, the 72nd, where a soft blue glow pulsed like a heartbeat against the New York night sky. Before we reveal what Jake found behind those glowing windows, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't believe how this small-town hero from Queens takes on the most powerful corporation in America. Drop a comment and tell us what you would have done in his situation. Jake Morrison had grown up in Queens, the son of a subway conductor who taught him that America was built by working people who looked out for each other. His calloused hands had pulled dozens of families from burning buildings, and his weathered face bore the scars of a man who'd chosen service over profit every single day of his life. At 52, he still believed that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing, a belief that was about to put him at war with forces he'd never imagined. The Nexus Tower lobby gleamed with marble imported from Italy, and artwork worth more than Jake's entire firehouse budget. Security guards in $1,000 suits watched them with barely concealed irritation as Jake's crew tracked soot and ash across floors that probably cost more per square foot than most people made in a year. But Jake had learned long ago that fancy buildings burn just like tenements, and rich people suffocated just like poor people when the smoke got too thick. 67th floor, sir, the head of security announced, with the kind of polished arrogance that came from guarding people who thought they owned the world. Our sensors indicate a minor malfunction. Shouldn't take long to clear. But Jake noticed the man's hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes kept darting toward the elevator bank like he was expecting someone or something that he really didn't want to see. The elevator ride to the 67th floor felt wrong from the moment the doors closed. Jake had ridden thousands of elevators in his career, but this one moved with a silence that seemed almost unnatural. His lieutenant, Tommy Ricci, a Brooklyn native whose grandfather had helped build these very skyscrapers, kept checking his equipment with the nervous energy of a man who'd learned to trust his gut. "Cap, you notice how quiet this building is?" Tommy whispered as the floor numbers climbed. "Even at midnight, these corporate towers usually have cleaning crews, security patrols, something. This place feels like a tomb." When the elevator doors opened on the 67th floor, Jake's 23 years of experience told him immediately that there was no fire, no smoke, no malfunction of any kind. The floor was pristine, filled with empty cubicles and conference rooms that looked like they'd been abandoned in the middle of a normal business day. Coffee cups sat half-finished on desks, computer screens glowed with frozen spreadsheets, and somewhere in the distance a phone rang endlessly, with no one to answer it. But what made Jake's skin crawl was the smell. Not smoke or electrical burning, but something chemical and wrong, like a hospital mixed with a laboratory. "This doesn't make sense," Jake muttered as he swept his flashlight across the empty workspace. Every instinct he'd developed over 2 decades of emergency response was screaming that they were walking into a trap, but he couldn't figure out who would want to trap a bunch of firefighters or why. Then Tommy's voice crackled over the radio from the stairwell. Cap, you need to see this. There's another floor between 72 and 73 that's not on any of the building schematics. And the access door has a biometric scanner. Jake felt his heart rate spike as he processed what Tommy had just told him. In his experience, secret floors in corporate buildings usually meant one of two things. Either someone was hiding money they didn't want the government to know about, or they were doing something that would put them in federal prison if anyone found out. Given the strange emptiness of this building and the nervous behavior of the security staff, Jake was beginning to suspect it was the latter. The stairwell between the 72nd and 73rd floors looked like something out of a science fiction movie, rather than a Manhattan office building. Instead of the standard concrete and steel construction Jake had seen in thousands of emergency calls, this section was lined with some kind of metallic material that seemed to absorb sound and light. The door Tommy had found was indeed equipped with a biometric scanner, but more unsettling was the warning sign mounted next to it. Authorized personnel only, neurological research in progress, cognitive enhancement project classified. Jake stared at the sign with growing unease. Cognitive enhancement could mean anything from helping stroke victims recover their memory to developing new treatments for Alzheimer's disease. But something about finding it hidden in a secret floor of a Wall Street corporation at midnight felt deeply wrong. His father had taught him that honest work was done in the light of day, and whatever Nexus Corporation was doing behind that unmarked door was definitely being done in the shadows. "Tommy, try to raise the chief on the radio," Jake ordered, his voice tight with tension. "Tell him we've got an unusual situation here and we might need backup." But as Tommy keyed his radio, nothing came through except static. The building's steel and concrete structure should have allowed clear communication with the outside world, but something was jamming their signals. Jake had seen this before in buildings where people were trying to hide their activities from law enforcement. The biometric scanner beside the door suddenly flashed green, and Jake heard the unmistakable sound of heavy locks disengaging. Someone inside knew they were there and had just given them access, but whether that was an invitation or a trap, Jake couldn't tell. His hand instinctively moved to the oxygen tank on his back as the door swung open to reveal a corridor that looked more like a high-tech laboratory than anything that should exist in a corporate office building. The hallway beyond the door was illuminated by the same blue glow Jake had seen from the street, emanating from strips of LED lighting that pulsed in a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. The walls were lined with observation windows, and through them Jake could see rows of what looked like hospital beds, each equipped with complex arrays of electronic equipment. But what made his blood run cold was the realization that some of those beds were occupied by people who appeared to be unconscious, with electrodes attached to their heads and intravenous lines running into their arms. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered, as he joined Jake at the observation window. "Cap, those people, they're not moving, are they?" He couldn't finish the question, but Jake understood. In their line of work, they'd seen too many victims who'd arrived at the hospital too late for the doctors to save. But these people didn't look dead. They looked like they were sleeping, or maybe drugged into unconsciousness while machines monitored their brain activity. Jake's training kicked in automatically. If there were injured or endangered civilians in this building, his job was to get them to safety, regardless of who had put them in danger or why. But as he moved toward the door that led to the room with the beds, a voice behind him made him freeze. "Captain Morrison, I was hoping we could have a conversation before you do anything rash." The man who stepped out of the shadows was tall and impeccably dressed, with the kind of artificial smile that came from decades of lying to people for a living. His suit probably cost more than Jake made in 3 months, and his handshake was the calculated grip of someone who'd learned to project confidence even when he was terrified. But Jake could see the fear in his eyes, and more importantly, He could see the contempt, the look of a man who thought he was dealing with someone too stupid to understand what was really going on. Dr. Marcus Webb, the man introduced himself, with practiced smoothness. I'm the director of Nexus Corporation's Cognitive Research Division. I apologize for the confusion about the emergency call. One of our security systems malfunctioned and triggered an automatic fire alarm. But I assure you, everything here is completely legal and above board. But even as he spoke, Jake could see him calculating angles, looking for exits, planning his next move like a cornered animal. Then you won't mind if we take a look around and make sure everyone's safe, Jake replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades dealing with people in crisis. Those folks in the beds look like they might need medical attention, and we're trained in emergency medical response. But Dr. Webb's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that instant, Jake saw something that made his stomach clench with recognition. The cold, calculating look of a predator who'd been caught in the act. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Dr. Webb said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that rich people used when they thought they were dealing with someone beneath their social class. These are volunteer participants in a groundbreaking study of sleep disorders and dream enhancement. They're under constant medical supervision, and any interruption could compromise months of research that could help millions of Americans get better sleep. But Jake had heard enough lies in his career to recognize when someone was improvising desperately. Tommy's hand moved instinctively toward the radio on his belt, but Jake caught his eye and shook his head slightly. Something about this situation felt like it was balanced on a knife's edge, and he didn't want to trigger whatever Dr. Webb was obviously preparing for. Instead, he took a step closer to the observation window and studied the scene more carefully. The people in the beds weren't just sleeping. They were connected to sophisticated equipment that was monitoring and apparently influencing their brain activity in real time. Dr. Webb, Jake said slowly, his trained eye taking in details that the corporate executive probably didn't realize he was noticing. I've been a first responder for more than 20 years, and I've seen plenty of sleep studies. They don't usually require IV sedation or that level of neurological monitoring. And they definitely don't require biometric security systems or jamming equipment that blocks radio communications. The last part was a calculated guess, but the way Webb's face went pale told Jake he'd hit the mark. The silence stretched between them for several seconds, and Jake could feel the tension in the air, like the moment before a backdraft when superheated gases were about to explode into flames. Dr. Webb was clearly trying to decide whether to continue lying, call for security, or try a different approach entirely. But whatever choice he made, Jake was beginning to realize that he and Tommy had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple fire alarm malfunction. "Captain Morrison," Dr. Webb finally said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of government, but I think you have a right to know what you've walked into. The people in those beds aren't just research subjects. They're American citizens who volunteered to help us develop technology that could end mental illness, PTSD, and depression forever. But if word of this research leaks out before we're ready, it could set back medical science by decades and cost lives that we could otherwise save." Jake felt his jaw clench as he recognized the classic manipulation tactic. Make the victim feel responsible for the consequences of exposing the truth. He'd seen it used by arsonists who claimed they were just trying to collect insurance money to feed their families, and by domestic abusers who insisted they only hit their wives because they loved them so much. Dr. Webb was trying to make him complicit in whatever was happening here by appealing to his desire to help people. If this research is so legitimate, Jake asked quietly. "Then why is it being conducted in secret in an unlisted floor of a corporate building in the middle of the night? Why are your subjects so heavily sedated that they can't consent to... What's being done to them? And why did you jam our radio communications the moment we entered this building?" Each question hit Webb like a physical blow, and Jake could see the man's carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. But before Dr. Webb could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the hidden floor, and red emergency lights started strobing in the corridors. Over the building's intercom system, a computerized voice announced with mechanical precision, "Security breach detected. Initiate Containment Protocol 7. All research subjects to be terminated immediately to prevent exposure." Jake's blood turned to ice as he realized what he'd just heard. Whatever Nexus Corporation was doing to those people, they were prepared to kill them rather than let the truth come out. And now he and Tommy were trapped in a corporate nightmare where human lives were considered acceptable casualties in whatever sick experiment was being conducted behind closed doors. Chapter 2. The Impossible Odds. The next 60 seconds unfolded like a choreographed dance of death that Jake Morrison had only seen in war movies. Through the observation windows, he watched as white-coated technicians began moving among the unconscious subjects with syringes filled with what he instinctively knew was a lethal cocktail designed to silence witnesses permanently. Dr. Webb's mask of corporate civility had completely dropped, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who viewed human beings as expendable test subjects in his quest for ultimate power over the human mind. "You really shouldn't have come here tonight, Captain," Webb said with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather while ordering mass murder. "These people volunteered to help us perfect a technology that will bring peace and prosperity to America. Their sacrifice will be remembered when we eliminate crime, terrorism, and political dissent forever." The casual way he spoke about ending human lives made Jake's hands ball into fists, but 23 years of emergency response training had taught him to control his emotions when lives hung in the balance. Jake's mind raced through the tactical situation with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through countless burning buildings and collapsing structures. He and Tommy were trapped on a secret floor of a high-security building. Their communications were jammed, and they were facing an unknown number of adversaries who were willing to commit mass murder to protect their secret. But Jake had one advantage that Dr. Webb probably hadn't counted on. He'd spent 2 decades learning how to save people from situations that seemed hopeless. "Tommy," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a veteran firefighter giving orders. "In a crisis, remember the Bronx warehouse fire in '09? Same principles apply here." Tommy's eyes widened as he understood the reference. A situation where they'd been trapped by a deliberately set fire and had to create their own exit route through superior knowledge of building systems and emergency protocols. The warehouse fire had taught Jake that every building had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who understood how structures worked under stress. Corporate towers like Nexus were built to impress visitors and intimidate competitors, but they were also required by law to have multiple emergency systems that could be turned against their owners by someone with the right knowledge and enough desperation. Dr. Webb was still talking, his voice taking on the fervent tone of a true believer, explaining his vision for a perfect world. "You see, Captain, the American people have proven they can't be trusted to make rational decisions. They vote for demagogues, they believe conspiracy theories, they resist scientific progress that could solve every problem we face. But with our cognitive enhancement technology, we can guide their thoughts toward more productive patterns. Imagine a world without crime, without political extremism, without the chaos of individual free will. As Webb spoke, Jake was mentally cataloging every detail of the hidden floor's layout and security systems. The biometric scanners weren't just for access control. They were also connected to fire suppression systems that could flood the entire floor with halon gas if activated. The observation windows weren't just one-way glass. They were part of a containment system designed to prevent contamination from escaping if something went wrong with an experiment. And most importantly, the building's main fire suppression system was controlled from a central station that Jake could access if he could reach the mechanical floor 2 levels down. "The Super Bowl is in 47 hours, Dr. Webb continued, his eyes gleaming with the fanatic intensity of a man who believed he was saving the world by enslaving it. 115 million Americans will be watching, and every single television, computer, and mobile device in the country will be broadcasting our signal. Within minutes of kickoff, we'll have achieved what no government in history has ever managed: complete cognitive control over an entire population." Jake felt his stomach drop as the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about the dozen people strapped to beds on this secret floor. This was about turning every American citizen into a remote-controlled slave of corporate power. The technology they were perfecting here would be deployed through every screen in America during the most watched event of the year, when families gathered together and defenses were down. Tommy caught Jake's eye and tapped his oxygen gauge. They had maybe 20 minutes of air left in their tanks, but more importantly, he was signaling that he'd spotted something Webb probably didn't want them to notice. Behind the doctor, a wall-mounted display showed the building's security camera feeds, and Jake could see armed men in tactical gear taking positions throughout the tower. Whatever Webb's original plan had been, he was now moving to a more aggressive phase of the operation. "Dr. Webb," Jake said carefully, buying time while he formulated a plan, "you're talking about mind control technology that could affect millions of people. Surely the government has oversight of this kind of research. The FDA, the CDC, someone must be monitoring what you're doing here." But even as he spoke, Jake could see from Webb's expression that the corruption went much deeper than one rogue corporation. "Captain Morrison," Webb replied with the smug satisfaction of a man revealing his masterstroke, "who do you think is funding this research? The Department of Defense has been searching for effective crowd control methods since the 1960s. The Department of Homeland Security wants to eliminate domestic terrorism by controlling the thoughts of potential terrorists. Even the FDA is on board because we've promised to end mental illness forever. This technology has the full support of the United States government." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. If Webb was telling the truth, then exposing this conspiracy wouldn't just mean fighting a corrupt corporation. It would mean taking on elements within the federal government itself. But Jake Morrison hadn't spent 2 decades pulling people out of burning buildings because he was afraid of powerful enemies. He'd done it because he believed that every human life had value and that sometimes ordinary people had to do extraordinary things to protect the innocent. Through the observation windows, Jake could see that the technicians had finished preparing their lethal injections and were now moving systematically from bed to bed. The first victim, a young woman who looked like she might be a college student, received her injection and immediately went into convulsions before falling still. The casual efficiency with which they murdered her told Jake that this wasn't the first time Nexus Corporation had eliminated inconvenient witnesses. "You're making a mistake, Dr. Webb," Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man who'd seen enough evil for one lifetime. "I've pulled kids out of buildings that were collapsing around them, and I've carried grandmothers down 40 flights of stairs through smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You think I'm going to walk away and let you murder innocent Americans because some bureaucrats in Washington gave you permission? Webb's expression shifted from smug confidence to genuine concern as he recognized something in Jake's voice that he hadn't expected. The absolute certainty of a man who'd already decided he was willing to die rather than compromise his principles. Corporate executives were used to dealing with people who could be bought, threatened, or reasoned with through appeals to self-interest. They weren't prepared for someone whose moral code was more important to them than their own survival. "Captain Morrison," Webb said, his voice taking on a more urgent tone, "you need to understand the bigger picture here. American democracy is failing. We have mass shootings every week. Political violence is escalating, and social media is turning citizens against each other with unprecedented efficiency. Our technology could end all of that by ensuring that people make rational decisions based on accurate information rather than emotional responses to propaganda." Jake's training as a firefighter had taught him to recognize when someone was trying to distract him from the immediate danger while preparing to strike. Webb was positioning himself between Jake and the door to the laboratory, while somewhere in the building, those armed security teams were moving into position. But Jake had also learned that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, especially when innocent lives were hanging in the balance. "Tommy," Jake said quietly, "on my signal, hit the emergency fire suppression system for this floor. The control panel is behind Dr. Webb's left shoulder. I'm going to give our friends in the lab something more pressing to worry about than murdering civilians." Tommy nodded grimly, his hand moving toward the equipment on his belt that could override the building's safety systems if necessary. Dr. Webb must have sensed that the dynamic in the room was shifting, because his hand moved toward what was obviously a panic button concealed in his jacket pocket. But Jake Morrison hadn't survived 23 years of fighting fires by letting his opponents dictate the terms of engagement. He'd learned long ago that when faced with an impossible situation, sometimes the only solution was to make it impossible, for everyone else too. Chapter 3. The Line in the Sand. The fire suppression system activated with a roar that shook the entire floor. And within seconds, the secret laboratory was flooded with halon gas that sent technicians scrambling for emergency breathing equipment. Dr. Webb's carefully orchestrated execution had suddenly turned into chaos as alarms blared and emergency lighting cast everything in an hellish red glow. But Jake Morrison had fought fires in conditions far worse than this, and he was already moving toward the laboratory door while his enemies struggled to see through the suppression cloud. "You've just killed us all!" Webb screamed over the noise of the alarms, his corporate composure finally cracking under the pressure. "The gas will dissipate in 10 minutes, but building security will seal this floor permanently rather than let word of this research escape. We'll all suffocate together, Captain Morrison. You, me, your partner, and every test subject you thought you were trying to save." But Jake had counted on Webb's reaction, because men like him always revealed their true priorities when their carefully constructed plans fell apart. The doctor was already pulling out a gas mask that he'd obviously kept hidden for exactly this kind of emergency, which meant he'd been prepared to sacrifice his own research team if necessary. More importantly, his threat about sealing the floor confirmed that there was an escape route that Webb planned to use while leaving everyone else behind. Through the chaos of the suppression system, Jake could hear Tommy moving among the beds. In the laboratory, disconnecting IV lines and trying to wake subjects who'd been kept unconscious for God only knew how long. Some of them were beginning to stir as the sedative drips were cut off, but others appeared to be in deeper states of unconsciousness that might require medical intervention to reverse safely. "Cap!" Tommy's voice carried over the noise of the alarms. "I've got 12 people here, but half of them aren't responding to normal stimuli. Looks like they've been drugged with something a lot stronger than standard surgical anesthesia. And there's equipment here I've never seen before. Some kind of electromagnetic field generators positioned around each bed. Jake felt his blood chill as he realized what Tommy had discovered. The beds weren't just for medical monitoring. They were designed to subject the victims to some form of electromagnetic manipulation while they were unconscious. Whatever Nexus Corporation was testing, it went far beyond simple mind control technology into something that could potentially cause permanent brain damage or death. Dr. Webb was fumbling with his gas mask when Jake reached him, and for a moment, the two men faced each other through the haze of suppression chemicals. Webb's eyes held the desperate calculation of a cornered predator, but Jake could see something else there too. Genuine fear that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him. "Doctor," Jake said with the quiet intensity of a man who'd made peace with his own mortality years earlier, "you've got about 30 seconds to tell me how to safely disconnect your victims from that equipment before I start ripping cables out and hoping for the best. And if you're thinking about calling your security team, remember that I'm wearing a full-face respirator and you're not." The standoff lasted exactly 15 seconds before Webb's survival instincts overcame his loyalty to the conspiracy. His hands shaking, he pulled a tablet computer from his jacket and began entering commands with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that cooperation was his only chance of survival. "The electromagnetic field generators have to be powered down gradually," he admitted, his voice muffled by the emergency breathing apparatus. "Sudden disconnection could cause seizures or cardiac arrest." But even as Webb worked to safely disconnect his victims, Jake could hear the sound of tactical boots in the stairwells and the distinctive whine of hydraulic equipment being positioned outside the sealed floor. Dr. Webb hadn't been bluffing about building security. They were indeed preparing to seal the entire level rather than allow evidence of the mind control experiments to escape into the world. "Tommy!" Jake shouted over the diminishing roar of the suppression system. "How many people can we move, and how fast can we move them?" The answer would determine whether they tried to evacuate the victims through conventional routes or whether Jake would have to implement the more dangerous backup plan he'd been developing since the moment he'd realized the scope of the conspiracy. "I've got 8 people who are conscious enough to walk with assistance," Tommy replied, his voice tight with the strain of trying to coordinate a mass casualty evacuation under combat conditions. "But 4 of them are still connected to life support equipment that I don't dare disconnect without medical supervision. And Cap, some of these people have been here for weeks, maybe months. Their muscle mass is severely degraded, and I don't think they can handle rapid movement." Jake's mind raced through the tactical mathematics of the situation. 12 victims who needed medical attention, an unknown number of armed hostiles converging on their position, and escape routes that were being systematically sealed by enemies who were willing to commit mass murder rather than allow their secrets to be exposed. But Jake Morrison had built his entire career on saving people from impossible situations, and he wasn't about to start making exceptions now. The tablet in Dr. Webb's hands chimed softly as the electromagnetic field generators powered down, and immediately the atmosphere in the laboratory changed in a way that Jake could feel rather than see. Several of the victims who'd been unconscious suddenly began showing signs of increased brain activity, and 2 of them opened their eyes for the first time since Jake had arrived. "My God," whispered one of the newly awakened subjects, a middle-aged man whose eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd experienced psychological trauma beyond normal comprehension. They've been inside my head for weeks, making me think things, feel things that weren't my own thoughts. They said they were curing my depression, but they were changing who I am." The revelation confirmed Jake's worst fears about what Nexus Corporation was actually doing in their secret laboratory. This wasn't medical research designed to help people. It was a systematic program of psychological manipulation and mental conditioning designed to create a new generation of Americans whose thoughts and beliefs could be controlled remotely by corporate interests. But Jake didn't have time to process the full implications of what he discovered, because the sound of cutting torches had begun echoing through the walls around them. Webb's security team wasn't just sealing the floor, they were preparing to breach the laboratory itself, probably with orders to eliminate every witness to the mind control experiments. "Dr. Webb," Jake said with the calm authority of a man who'd spent decades making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, "I need you to tell me about the building's emergency evacuation systems, fire escapes, service elevators, maintenance, tunnels, anything that your security team might not be monitoring." But Webb's expression told Jake that the doctor was calculating whether cooperating further would increase or decrease his chances of survival. The cutting torches were getting louder, and Jake could see sparks beginning to appear around the edges of the laboratory's main door. Whatever decision he made, it had to be made in the next 60 seconds, because after that, the initiative would belong to armed men whose only job was to ensure that nobody left this floor alive. "There's a service tunnel that connects to the building's main ventilation system," Webb finally admitted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the breaching equipment. "It leads to the mechanical floors where the building's main computer systems are housed. But Captain Morrison, you have to understand, if you try to expose this research, you'll be fighting the most powerful corporations in America. They have unlimited resources and no moral constraints. They'll destroy your life, your family, everything you've ever cared about." Jake looked around the laboratory at the dozen human beings who'd been reduced to test subjects in a corporate experiment to steal the minds of American citizens. Some of them were beginning to remember who they'd been before Nexus Corporation had gotten their claws into them, while others might never fully recover from the psychological conditioning they'd endured. But all of them deserved better than to die in a corporate cover-up, orchestrated by people who viewed human consciousness as just another commodity to be bought and sold. "Doctor," Jake said, as he helped Tommy prepare the victims for emergency evacuation. "I've been fighting fires for 23 years, and I've learned something about powerful people who think they can't be stopped. Buildings burn just as fast when they belong to billionaires, and gravity works the same on corporate executives as it does on everyone else. These people might have unlimited money, but they've never faced someone who's got nothing left to lose." The sparks around the door were getting brighter, and Jake could hear voices coordinating the final breach of the laboratory. But he'd also noticed something that Dr. Webb probably hadn't intended for him to see. The building's main fire suppression system was controlled from this floor, and if Jake could reach those controls, he could flood the entire Nexus Tower with suppression chemicals that would force an evacuation and bring fire department reinforcements that couldn't be bought off or intimidated. "Tommy," Jake said as he moved toward the service tunnel that Webb had revealed, "get our people into that ventilation system and start moving them toward the mechanical floors. I'm going to give our friends with the cutting torches something to think about besides murdering witnesses." But as Jake reached for the building's fire suppression controls, he realized that this was the moment when his old life as a simple firefighter ended and his new life as an enemy of corporate America began. Chapter 4. David's Slingshot, the Service. Tunnel was barely wide enough for a man in full firefighting gear, but Jake Morrison had crawled through tighter spaces while carrying unconscious victims out of burning buildings. Behind him, he could hear Tommy coordinating the evacuation of Dr. Webb's test subjects through whispered commands that wouldn't carry to the security teams now breaching the laboratory. But Jake's destination was the building's central fire. control system, where he could trigger an emergency evacuation that would bring half the FDNY to Nexus Tower and make it impossible for the conspiracy to continue operating in secret. The mechanical floor, 2 levels below the secret laboratory, looked like the engine room of a spacecraft, rather than anything Jake had seen in conventional office buildings. Banks of computer servers hummed with electronic activity, and massive air handling units moved climate-controlled air throughout the tower with mechanical precision. But what caught Jake's attention was the central fire control panel, a sophisticated system that could override every safety mechanism in the building and trigger evacuations that would require coordination with city emergency services. As Jake's fingers worked across the control panel with the expertise of someone who'd spent decades mastering building safety systems, he began to understand the true scope of what Nexus Corporation had built. This wasn't just a corporate headquarters. It was a fortress designed to house illegal research and protect it from outside interference. But like all fortresses, its defenses could be turned against its occupants by someone who understood how they worked. The building's fire suppression system was connected to a central database that tracked every person entering or leaving the tower, every electronic device connected to the building's network, and every communication signal transmitted from within its walls. But Jake realized that this surveillance network was also the building's greatest vulnerability, because once he triggered a full emergency response, every detail of Nexus Corporation's activities would be recorded and transmitted to Fire Department, computers that couldn't be compromised or destroyed. Engine 19 to Central, Jake spoke into his radio as the building's jamming system was automatically disabled by the fire emergency protocols. "We have a code red situation at Nexus Tower. I need every available unit, hazmat team, and federal authorities on scene immediately. We're dealing with chemical contamination and multiple casualties in a corporate research facility." But even as he transmitted his emergency request, Jake could hear tactical teams moving through the floors below, searching for the witnesses they'd been ordered to eliminate. The response from Central came back immediately, crackling with the urgency of a dispatcher who recognized the voice of one of the department's most experienced captains. "Jake, we've got units rolling from 6 stations, ETA 12 minutes. What's your situation?" But Jake knew that 12 minutes might be too long if Webb's security teams reached the mechanical floor before help arrived. Through the building's security monitors, Jake could see that the secret laboratory had been completely breached, and armed men were systematically searching every room for signs of the escaped test subjects. Dr. Webb was cooperating fully with the search, apparently having decided that his survival depended on demonstrating his loyalty to the conspiracy. But what made Jake's blood run cold was seeing additional security teams entering the building's lower floors, armed with equipment that suggested they were prepared for a prolonged siege. Tommy's voice crackled over the radio from somewhere in the building's ventilation system. "Cap, I've got 11 people moving toward the parking garage level, but one of our subjects collapsed, and I'm not sure we can move him without medical attention. Also, these folks are starting to remember things they'd been made to forget, and what they're telling me about this place. Jesus, Jake, we need to get word to the FBI, the Justice Department, someone with the authority to shut this whole operation down." But Jake was beginning to realize that conventional law enforcement might not be sufficient to stop a conspiracy that apparently had the support of elements within the federal government itself. Dr. Webb had claimed that the Department of Defense and Homeland Security were funding the mind control research, which meant that exposing the conspiracy might require more than just following normal legal procedures. The elevator system chimed softly, and Jake realized that security teams were using the building's express elevators to rapidly deploy throughout the tower. But his 23 years of firefighting experience had taught him that elevators were death traps during emergencies, and he'd learned to use building systems in ways that their designers had never intended. Jake's hands moved across the fire control panel with surgical precision, activating emergency protocols that would shut down the elevators between floors and trap anyone inside them until fire department personnel could coordinate their rescue. Within seconds, the building's security monitors showed armed men trapped between floors throughout the tower, unable to continue their search for witnesses and unable to coordinate their response to the rapidly changing situation. But Jake's satisfaction was short-lived because the building's main computer system began displaying warning messages that made his blood run cold. Cognitive enhancement, broadcast system activating, Super Bowl transmission in 46 hours, 23 minutes. Field. Test parameters confirmed, nationwide deployment authorized. The conspiracy wasn't just about the test subjects trapped in Nexus Tower. It was about turning every American watching television into a remotely controlled slave of corporate power. The mechanical floor's main computer terminal was protected by multiple layers of security, but Jake remembered something his father had taught him about fighting systems that seemed too powerful to defeat. Every machine had an off switch, and every building had a way to cut power to its most critical systems. The question was whether Jake could find and activate those systems before Dr. Webb's security teams regrouped and eliminated the evidence of their crimes. Through the building's communication system, Jake could hear Dr. Webb's voice coordinating with someone who was obviously his superior in the conspiracy. "Sir, the containment has been compromised, but we still have 46 hours before the Super Bowl broadcast. If we can eliminate the witnesses and activate the backup research facility in Virginia, we can proceed with the nationwide deployment on schedule." The revelation that there were additional facilities working on the mind control technology made Jake realize that stopping Nexus Corporation would require more than just exposing their crimes. It would require systematically dismantling an entire network of facilities and personnel that were preparing to enslave the American people. But Jake Morrison had learned long ago that the biggest fires started with single sparks, and sometimes one person with enough determination could bring down an entire corrupt system. Jake's radio crackled with Tommy's voice from the buildings. "Lower levels. Cap, we've reached the parking garage, and I've got fire department vehicles pulling up outside. But we've also got federal agents out there, FBI, Homeland Security, maybe others. I can't tell if they're here to help us or to cover up what we've found." The arrival of federal agents confirmed Jake's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. If elements within the government were involved in funding the mind control research, then exposing the truth would require more than just following normal legal procedures. Jake would have to find a way to get the evidence into the hands of people he could trust, journalists, civil liberties organizations, maybe members of Congress who weren't compromised by corporate influence. But first, he had to make sure that the evidence survived long enough to be exposed. The building's main computer system contained records of every experiment, every test subject, and every aspect of the mind control technology that Nexus Corporation had developed. If Jake could download that information and get it to people who could act on it, the conspiracy would be exposed, regardless of how many federal agents were involved in the cover-up. Jake's fingers moved across the computer keyboard with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that he might have only minutes before armed men broke through his defenses. The system's security was sophisticated, but it wasn't designed to prevent access by someone who understood building emergency systems and had legitimate firefighter credentials that overrode normal security protocols during disaster response. What Jake found in the computer files made him physically sick. Nexus Corporation hadn't just been experimenting on voluntary subjects. They'd been kidnapping homeless people, runaway teenagers, and mentally ill patients from state hospitals to use as test subjects for their mind control technology. The files contained video recordings of experiments where victims were subjected to electromagnetic fields that left them catatonic, drug combinations that erased their memories, and psychological conditioning that turned them into obedient servants who would follow any command. But the most horrifying discovery was the scope of the planned Super Bowl deployment. The mind control signal wouldn't just be transmitted through television broadcasts. It would be embedded in internet traffic, cell phone communications, and even radio transmissions. Within hours of activation, every American connected to any form of electronic media would be exposed to subliminal programming designed to make them docile, obedient, and unable to question authority. "Tommy," Jake spoke into his radio as he began downloading the most critical files to a portable storage device, "I need you to get our witnesses to someone outside the federal law enforcement chain, maybe state authorities, local news media, civil rights organizations. What we've found here goes all the way to the top of the federal government, and we can't trust normal channels." But even as Jake worked to preserve the evidence, he could hear the sound of cutting equipment being used on the mechanical floor's security doors. Dr. Webb's security teams had found alternative routes through the building and were preparing to eliminate the last witness to their crimes. Jake had maybe 5 minutes before they breached his position, and the computer download would take at least 10 minutes to complete. The building's fire suppression system offered one last desperate option. If Jake could flood the entire tower with suppression chemicals, it would force a complete evacuation that would bring every emergency service in the city to Nexus Tower. The resulting chaos would make it impossible for the conspiracy to eliminate witnesses quietly, and the presence of so many outside agencies would ensure that at least some evidence survived. But activating building-wide suppression would also put Tommy and the rescued test subjects at risk, because halon gas could be deadly in confined spaces without proper breathing equipment. Jake was facing the kind of impossible choice that had defined his entire career as a firefighter: risk some lives to save many others, or try to save everyone and risk losing everything. Jake's decision was made for him when the mechanical floor's main door exploded inward, and armed men in tactical gear began pouring through the breach. But Jake Morrison hadn't spent 23 years fighting fires by giving up when the odds turned against him. He had one last card to play, and if it worked, it would bring down the entire conspiracy that thought it could turn American citizens into remote-controlled slaves. His hand slammed down on the building-wide fire suppression activation switch, just as the first bullets began flying across the mechanical floor. The last thing Jake saw before diving for cover behind a bank of computer servers was the look of absolute terror on Dr. Webb's face, as he realized that his carefully constructed fortress was about to become his tomb. Chapter 5. The system strikes. The halon gas flooded through Nexus Tower with the force of a chemical hurricane, and within minutes the building's 78 floors were filled with suppression chemicals that made normal breathing impossible without emergency equipment. Jake Morrison pressed his face mask tight against his face as automatic weapons fire echoed through the mechanical floor. But he knew that his attackers were now facing the same problem that had claimed the lives of so many criminals who'd tried. To rob banks by setting them on fire, you can't shoot what you can't see, and you can't see anything when you're suffocating. Through the chaos of the gas release, Jake could hear the sound of emergency vehicles converging on Nexus Tower from every direction. Fire trucks, ambulances, police units, federal response teams, and news helicopters were all racing toward the building that was now venting toxic chemicals into the Manhattan skyline. But Jake also knew that some of those federal agents were part of the conspiracy, and they would be working frantically to contain the evidence before it could reach people who might act on it. The computer download was still running when Jake heard Dr. Webb's voice through the suppression cloud, screaming orders that revealed the true desperation of the conspiracy. "Forget the witnesses, get to the servers and destroy everything. The backup facility in Virginia can handle the Super Bowl deployment, but we cannot allow these files to reach the media." Jake realized that Webb was willing to sacrifice his own people rather than let the evidence of the mind control experiments reach the outside world. But the doctor had made a critical error. He'd revealed that there was a backup facility in Virginia that was still operational, which meant that stopping Nexus Corporation wouldn't be enough to prevent the Super Bowl deployment of the mind control technology. Tommy's voice crackled through Jake's radio over the sound of automatic weapons and emergency sirens. "Cap, I've got our people out of the building and in the hands of FDNY medics. But we've also got federal agents trying to take custody of the witnesses, claiming they need to be debriefed for national security purposes. I'm pretty sure they're planning to disappear these folks permanently." The news confirmed Jake's suspicions about the federal involvement in the conspiracy. But it also meant that the window for exposing the truth was closing rapidly, because once the witnesses were in federal custody, they could be relocated, silenced, or eliminated without any chance of their testimony reaching the public. Jake's portable storage device chimed softly as the computer download completed. But the sound was almost lost in the chaos of gunfire and emergency alarms filling the mechanical floor. The device now contained gigabytes of evidence documenting every aspect of the mind control experiments, including video recordings of the torture and conditioning that victims had endured, financial records showing which government agencies had funded the research, and technical specifications for the broadcast system that would be deployed during the Super Bowl. But having the evidence and getting it to people who could act on it were two very different problems. Jake was trapped in a building filled with hostile federal agents. His radio communications were being monitored by people who wanted him dead, and he had less than 46 hours before the conspiracy deployed their mind control technology. On a national scale, the suppression gas was beginning to dissipate, and Jake could see muzzle flashes through the thinning haze as Webb's security team tried to locate and eliminate him. But Jake had spent his entire career learning to navigate through environments where visibility was zero, and every breath could be his last. He began moving through the mechanical floor with the silent precision of a hunter, using his knowledge of building systems to stay ahead of his pursuers. The building's main communication system was housed in a server room adjacent to the fire control center, and Jake realized that if he could access those systems, he might be able to transmit the downloaded evidence to multiple recipients simultaneously. Local news stations, civil liberties organizations, members of Congress, international journalists, anyone who might be beyond the reach of the federal agencies that were part of the conspiracy. But as Jake reached the communication center, he discovered that Dr. Webb had anticipated this possibility. The entire system had been locked down with security protocols that would require hours to bypass, and Jake could hear tactical teams converging on his position from multiple directions. He was running out of options, and the clock was ticking toward a deployment that would enslave every American citizen. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy's voice on the radio, speaking in the coded language that firefighters used when they needed to communicate sensitive information over monitored channels. Cap, our friends from the Fourth Estate are very interested in the story you've been working on. Channel 7 has a mobile unit standing by, and they're willing to go live immediately if you can provide them with source material. Jake understood immediately. Tommy had made contact with local news media and arranged for live television coverage that the conspiracy couldn't stop or control. If Jake could get the evidence to the news crew, they could broadcast it nationally before the federal agents could prevent its release. But first, he had to survive long enough to reach the rendezvous point that Tommy had arranged. The service. Tunnels that connected Nexus Tower to the city's infrastructure offered Jake's best chance of escaping the building without being captured by federal agents. But those same tunnels would also provide the conspiracy with opportunities to eliminate him quietly, away from the news cameras and emergency responders who were now surrounding the building. Jake's decision was made when he heard Dr. Webb's voice over the building's intercom system, speaking with the desperate authority of a man whose entire world was collapsing. Ladies and gentlemen of the federal response teams, the individual responsible for this terrorist attack on a classified research facility is Captain Jake Morrison of the FDNY. He has stolen classified information related to national security programs, and he must be apprehended before he can transmit that information to hostile foreign governments. The accusation of terrorism and espionage was obviously designed to justify killing Jake if he couldn't be captured alive, but it also revealed how frightened the conspiracy was of having their crimes exposed. Dr. Webb was willing to declare war on the New York Fire Department rather than allow the American people to learn what had been done to them in secret. But Jake Morrison had grown up in Queens, listening to his father's stories about fighting corruption and standing up for working people against powerful interests that thought they were above the law. He'd spent 23 years risking his life to save people who couldn't save themselves, and he wasn't about to let corporate America turn his fellow citizens into mind-controlled slaves without a fight. The service tunnel that led from Nexus Tower to the subway system was filled with the sounds of pursuit as federal agents tried to track Jake through the building's underground infrastructure. But Jake had learned to navigate through smoke-filled buildings, where a wrong turn meant death, and he used that experience to stay ahead of his hunters while making his way toward the rendezvous point where Tommy and the news crew were waiting. As Jake emerged from the tunnel system 6 blocks from Nexus Tower, he could see the full scope of the federal response to the terrorist attack on the building. Military vehicles, federal agents in tactical gear, and media crews from every major network were all converging on the area in a display of force designed to intimidate anyone who might be thinking about exposing the conspiracy. But Jake also saw something that gave him hope. Ordinary Americans gathering on the streets to watch the unfolding drama, holding cell phone cameras and asking questions about what was really happening inside Nexus Tower. The conspiracy might control federal agencies and corporate media, but they couldn't control the curiosity and determination of individual citizens who sensed that something was seriously wrong. Tommy was waiting in an unmarked van with a news crew from Channel 7, but Jake could see federal agents positioned throughout the area, obviously searching for him with orders that probably didn't include taking him alive. The next few minutes would determine whether the evidence of the mind control experiments reached the American people, or whether it died with Jake in a back alley where the cameras couldn't see. "Cap," Tommy said as Jake approached the van. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they spot us. The news crew is ready to go live, but once we start broadcasting, every federal agent in the city is going to come down on us like the hammer of God." Jake looked at the portable storage device containing evidence that could expose one of the most heinous conspiracies in American history. Then, at the news crew, who were risking their careers and possibly their lives to help him get the truth to the American people. In 45 hours, unless he acted now, 115 million Americans would lose their free will forever to corporate interests that viewed human consciousness as just another commodity to be bought and sold. "Let's go live," Jake said as he climbed into the van and handed the storage device to the lead reporter. The American people deserve to know what's being done to them, and they deserve to make their own choice about whether they want to fight back. Chapter 6. Truth and Consequences. The live television broadcast began at 2:17 a.m. on Sunday morning, and within minutes Channel 7's emergency interruption of regular programming was being picked up by news networks across the country. Jake Morrison sat in the mobile broadcast unit, his face still streaked with soot from the Nexus Tower fires, as he began revealing evidence of a conspiracy so massive that most viewers initially assumed they were watching a science fiction movie rather than breaking news coverage. "My name is Captain Jake Morrison, and I've been fighting fires in Manhattan for 23 years, Jake began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades telling people the truth in life-and-death situations. 3 hours ago, I responded to what I thought was a routine fire alarm at Nexus Corporation. What I found instead was a secret laboratory where American citizens were being subjected to mind control experiments designed to turn them into remote-controlled slaves. The reporter, Maria Gonzalez, had covered corruption stories throughout her 15-year career, but nothing had prepared her for the scope of what Jake was revealing. As she scrolled through the downloaded files on her laptop, her face went pale with the recognition that this wasn't just another corporate scandal. This was evidence of a systematic attempt to enslave the entire American population through electronic manipulation of their thoughts and emotions. "Captain Morrison?" Maria asked, her voice tight with professional control over her obvious shock. "You're alleging that a major American corporation has been conducting illegal medical experiments on kidnapped citizens. But these documents you've provided suggest something even more disturbing, that the federal government itself has been funding this research." Jake nodded grimly as he pulled up financial records showing millions of dollars in payments from the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and other federal agencies to Nexus Corporation's Cognitive Research Division. According to these files, the goal wasn't just to develop mind control technology, it was to deploy that technology nationwide during the Super Bowl broadcast in less than 45 hours. Every American watching television would be exposed to subliminal programming designed to make them docile and obedient to corporate authority. The revelation sent shockwaves through the viewing audience, but it also triggered an immediate response from federal authorities who'd been monitoring the broadcast. Through the van's windows, Jake could see tactical teams taking positions around their location, obviously preparing to end the transmission by force, if necessary. Tommy's voice crackled over the radio from his position as lookout. "Cap, we've got federal agents closing in from 3 directions. Looks like they're planning to take the van and everyone in it. We've got maybe 90 seconds before they move in." But Maria Gonzalez had spent her career exposing corruption, and she wasn't about to let federal intimidation tactics stop her from revealing the biggest story of her lifetime. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said directly to the camera, "we're broadcasting live from Manhattan, where federal agents are now attempting to silence our reporting of what appears to be a massive conspiracy against the American people. If this transmission is interrupted, you'll know that your government is willing to use force to prevent you from learning the truth." Jake used the remaining time to reveal the most critical evidence: video recordings of the torture and conditioning that Nexus Corporation had inflicted on their victims, technical specifications for the broadcast system that would deploy the mind control signals, and a complete list of government officials and corporate executives who were involved in the CIA conspiracy. "The backup facility is located in Arlington, Virginia," Jake said, as tactical teams began surrounding the broadcast van. "If the American people don't act to stop this conspiracy in the next 44 hours, every citizen of this country will lose their free will forever. This isn't a partisan political issue. This is about whether human consciousness itself will remain free or whether it will become the property of corporate interests." The transmission was cut abruptly as federal Agents disabled the van's broadcast equipment, but Jake could see through the windows that the damage had already been done. Social media networks were exploding with discussion of his revelations. Citizen journalists were uploading copies of the evidence files that had been transmitted during the broadcast, and spontaneous protests were beginning to form in major cities across the country. Dr. Webb's voice came through a bullhorn as federal agents prepared to storm the van. "Captain Morrison, you are under arrest for terrorism, espionage, and theft of classified government property. Exit the vehicle immediately with your hands visible, and you will not be harmed." But Jake Morrison had learned long ago that men like Dr. Webb only offered mercy when they were planning to betray it. The conspiracy had murdered innocent Americans to protect their secrets, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a firefighter who'd become inconvenient to their plans. Maria Gonzalez was frantically working her cell phone, trying to coordinate follow-up coverage with news organizations around the world. "Captain Morrison," she said urgently, "I've got contacts at the BBC, CNN International, and the Associated Press who are willing to continue reporting this story even if American media is silenced. But we need to get you somewhere safe where you can provide additional testimony." Tommy had been monitoring police and federal communications during the broadcast, and his news wasn't encouraging. "Cap, they're calling this a terrorist incident and authorizing lethal force if we resist arrest. But I've also got reports that members of Congress are demanding emergency hearings, and the governor of New York is calling for a state investigation that bypasses federal authority." The political response gave Jake hope that the conspiracy might not be as all-powerful as Dr. Webb had claimed. If enough state and local officials demanded answers, it might be possible to expose the truth, even if federal agencies tried to cover it up. But first, Jake had to survive the next few minutes without being eliminated by people who viewed murder as just another business expense. The standoff was broken by an unexpected intervention. Uniformed New York Police Department officers arriving on scene and demanding to know why federal agents were threatening one of the city's decorated firefighters without proper warrants or jurisdiction. The NYPD hadn't been briefed on the conspiracy, and they weren't about to let federal agencies operate in their city without following proper legal procedures. "This is Detective Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, NYPD," Jake heard over the tactical radio frequencies that Tommy was monitoring. "I need to see federal warrants and jurisdictional authorization before any arrests are made on my watch. Captain, Morrison is a respected member of this city's emergency services, and he's not going anywhere without proper due process." The confusion between federal agents and local police gave Jake the opening he needed to escape from the immediate trap. But he knew that his problems were just beginning. The conspiracy had been exposed, but it still had 44 hours to implement their Super Bowl deployment of the mind control technology. And now that Jake had declared war on some of the most powerful people in America, they would be coming after him with everything they had. As Jake slipped away from the federal containment area with Tommy's help, he could hear sirens and helicopters converging on their position from every direction. But he could also hear something else that gave him hope: the sound of ordinary Americans taking to the streets, demanding answers from their government and refusing to accept official denials of what they'd seen on television. The battle for America's freedom had just begun, and Jake Morrison was about to discover whether one firefighter from Queens could take on an entire system of corruption and win. Chapter 7. The David moment dawn was breaking over Manhattan when Jake Morrison and Tommy Ricci reached the safe house that Detective Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez had arranged in Queens, a small apartment above a family-owned diner where Jake's story had been playing on television screens throughout the night. But Jake barely had time to catch his breath before Tommy's radio crackled with news. that made his blood run cold. Federal agents had raided the Arlington, Virginia facility and were claiming they'd found nothing but legitimate medical research equipment. "They're getting ahead of the story," Tommy said grimly as he monitored news broadcasts on his tablet. CNN is reporting that Captain Jake Morrison is a disgruntled employee who fabricated evidence of government mind control programs. The FBI is claiming that Nexus Corporation was conducting authorized research on sleep disorders and that you assaulted federal agents while attempting to steal classified medical information. But Jake could also see signs that the conspiracy's control over the narrative wasn't as complete as they'd hoped. Social media networks were flooded with videos from the overnight broadcast, and citizen journalists were analyzing the evidence files faster than corporate media could debunk them. More importantly, the test subjects who'd been rescued from Nexus Tower were beginning to tell their stories to anyone who would listen. Maria Gonzalez had managed to interview 3 of the rescued victims before federal agents could take them into custody, and their testimonies were spreading across alternative media networks despite attempts to suppress them. Jennifer Walsh, a college student who disappeared from her campus 6 months earlier, described weeks of electromagnetic conditioning designed to make her compliant and suggestible. Robert Chen, a military veteran who'd been undergoing treatment for PTSD, revealed how his therapy sessions had been used to implant false memories and alter his personality. The worst part, Jennifer had told Maria during a clandestine interview in a Queens hospital, wasn't the physical pain or the drugs. They used to keep us unconscious. It was the feeling that my own thoughts weren't my own anymore. They could make me believe things, feel emotions, even remember events that never happened. And they told us that this was just the beginning, that soon every American would experience the same thing through their televisions. Jake stared at the television screen as Jennifer's testimony played, and he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. These weren't just abstract victims of corporate greed. They were real people whose minds had been violated by a conspiracy that viewed human consciousness as raw material for their experiments. And in 38 hours, unless Jake could stop them, 115 million Americans would suffer the same fate. Detective Rodriguez entered the safe house apartment carrying coffee and news that was both encouraging and terrifying. "Captain Morrison," she said, with the professional courtesy that cops reserved for each other in crisis situations, "I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that the governor has ordered a state investigation. 3 members of Congress are calling for emergency hearings, and the Attorney General of New York is considering criminal charges against Nexus Corporation." Jake waited for the other shoe to drop, because he could see from Rodriguez's expression that the bad news was going to be significant. "The bad news," she continued, "is that federal marshals have issued a warrant for your arrest on terrorism charges, and they're claiming you're armed and extremely dangerous. They've also put pressure on local media to stop reporting on your allegations, claiming it's a matter of national security." The federal response confirmed what Jake had suspected from the beginning. The conspiracy had support at the highest levels of government, and they were willing to use the full power of federal law enforcement to protect their secrets. But Jake had also learned something important from his overnight fight with Nexus Corporation. Even the most powerful conspiracies had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with enough determination and the right strategy. "Detective Rodriguez," Jake said with the calm authority of a man who'd made peace with the consequences of his choices, "I need you to get a message to every state and local law enforcement agency in the country. The federal government has been compromised by corporate interests, and they're planning to use mind control technology during the Super Bowl to enslave the American people. If we don't act in the next 38 hours, local law enforcement will be the only thing standing between citizens and complete corporate control." But even as Jake spoke, he could see news reports showing federal agents raiding television stations and newspaper offices across the country, seizing equipment, and arresting journalists who'd been reporting on the mind control conspiracy. The First Amendment was being suspended under the pretext of national security, and American citizens were losing their right to know what their government was doing in their name. Tommy had been monitoring radio communications between various law enforcement agencies, and what he was hearing painted a picture of a country rapidly descending into a constitutional crisis. "Cap," he reported grimly. "Federal agents are trying to take control of local police departments in major cities, claiming they have authority to coordinate the response to a terrorist threat. But a lot of local cops are refusing to cooperate, especially after seeing those interviews with the mind control victims." The resistance from local law enforcement gave Jake hope that the conspiracy might not be as all-powerful as they appeared. American police officers had sworn an oath to protect and serve their communities, not to help corporate interests enslave those communities. But Jake also knew that federal agencies had resources and authority that local cops couldn't match, especially if the conspiracy was willing to declare martial law to protect their secrets. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Webb himself, calling Jake's cell phone with an offer that revealed just how desperate the conspiracy had become. "Captain Morrison," Webb's voice carried none of his earlier arrogance, "I think we can reach an accommodation that serves everyone's interests. The Super Bowl deployment can be delayed indefinitely, and the mind control research can be transferred to legitimate medical applications that will help millions of Americans." But Jake had heard similar offers from criminals who'd been caught in the act, and he knew that Webb was simply trying to buy time while the conspiracy regrouped for another attempt. "Dr. Webb," Jake replied with the cold professionalism of a man who'd seen too much evil to be surprised by it anymore, "the only accommodation I'm interested in is watching you and your co-conspirators face justice for what you've done to innocent Americans." Webb's tone shifted to barely controlled panic as he realized that Jake couldn't be bought or intimidated. "You don't understand the forces you're fighting, Captain. Nexus Corporation is just one part of a network that includes the most powerful people in American government and business. If you continue this crusade, they will destroy not just you, but everyone you've ever cared about, your fellow firefighters, your family, your friends. No one will be safe from their retaliation." The threat confirmed what Jake had suspected about the scope of the conspiracy, but it also revealed something important. They were afraid of him. For all their wealth and power and federal connections, they were genuinely frightened of one firefighter from Queens who refused to be intimidated or corrupted. Jake's response was interrupted by Tommy's urgent voice from across the room. "Cap, you need to see this. CNN is reporting that the Super Bowl has been cancelled due to credible terrorist threats. But alternative media is saying that stadium workers found transmission equipment hidden throughout the venue, equipment that matches the technical specifications from the files you downloaded. The cancellation of the Super Bowl meant that the conspiracy's original deployment plan had been disrupted. But Jake knew they would have backup plans and alternative methods for reaching their target audience of 100 million Americans. More importantly, the discovery of transmission equipment at the stadium proved that Jake's allegations weren't the fantasies of a delusional firefighter. They were documented facts that the conspiracy could no longer deny. Detective Rodriguez was monitoring police channels when she suddenly looked up with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Captain Morrison, I've got news that's going to change everything. The Virginia Attorney General just announced that state police have raided the Arlington facility and seized servers containing what appears to be the complete technical specifications for the mind control broadcast system. They're also reporting that they've found evidence of additional facilities in Texas, California, and Colorado. The multi-state raids meant that the conspiracy was finally facing coordinated law enforcement action that they couldn't control or suppress through federal interference. But Jake knew that cornered criminals were often most dangerous when their escape routes were being cut off, and the people behind Nexus Corporation had already proven they were willing to commit mass murder to protect their secrets. As Jake prepared for what he knew would be the final confrontation with the conspiracy, he thought about his father's stories of fighting corruption and standing up for working people against powerful interests that thought they were above the law. The old man had always said that America's greatest strength wasn't its military or its economy. It was the willingness of ordinary citizens to do extraordinary things when their freedom was threatened. In 6 hours, Jake Morrison was going to discover whether one firefighter could bring down a conspiracy that had the support of corporate America and elements of the federal government. But he'd also learned something important over the past 36 hours. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. Chapter 8. The New America. The final confrontation came not in a dramatic shootout or a climactic battle, but in a federal courtroom in Manhattan, where Jake Morrison testified before a joint committee of Congress, state attorneys general, and international observers about what he'd discovered in the secret floors of Nexus Tower. The American people had demanded answers, and their elected representatives had finally found the courage to ask the hard questions that corporate media had been afraid to pursue. Captain Morrison, Senator Patricia Williams of Iowa, began her questioning with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a case. In your professional opinion, what would have happened if the Super Bowl broadcast had proceeded as planned, with the mind control technology embedded in the transmission signal? Jake looked across the packed courtroom at the faces of ordinary Americans who'd traveled from across the country to witness this hearing, and he saw the same determination that had carried him through 23 years of fighting fires and saving lives. Senator Williams, he replied with quiet certainty, based on the evidence I recovered from Nexus Corporation's servers, approximately 115 million Americans would have been exposed to electromagnetic frequencies, designed to make them compliant and suggestible to authority figures. Within weeks, possibly days, those citizens would have lost the ability to think independently or question the actions of their government. The revelation sent a murmur through the courtroom that was equal parts horror and relief. Horror at how close America had come to losing its freedom, and relief that the conspiracy had been exposed before it could achieve its goals. But Jake could also see federal officials in the gallery whose expressions suggested they were calculating damage control rather than seeking justice for the victims. Dr. Marcus Webb had been arrested 3 days earlier when Virginia State Police found him trying to destroy evidence at the Arlington facility, and his testimony had revealed the full scope of the mind control conspiracy. Nexus Corporation had been working with federal agencies, defense contractors, and international corporations to develop technology that would allow a small elite to control the thoughts and behaviors of entire populations. The goal was never medical treatment. Webb had admitted during his plea bargain negotiations. We were developing a system of cognitive control that would eliminate political dissent, labor unrest, and social instability by ensuring that citizens only thought thoughts that were approved by their betters. American democracy was seen as an obstacle to efficient governance, and our technology would have removed that obstacle permanently. But the most shocking revelation had come from Jennifer Walsh, the college student who'd been rescued from the mind control experiments and had found the courage to testify about her experiences. They didn't just want to control what we thought, she told the packed courtroom with the quiet strength of a survivor. They wanted to erase who we were as individuals and replace us with compliant versions that would serve their interests. They told us that independence and free will were outdated, concepts that humanity needed to evolve beyond. Jake watched as Jennifer's testimony reduced several committee members to tears, and he felt a surge of pride in the young woman who'd endured torture and conditioning, but had emerged with her humanity intact. She represented everything that the conspiracy had tried to destroy: individual courage, moral clarity, and the stubborn refusal to surrender her freedom to people who thought they knew better than she did about how her life should be lived. The investigation had revealed that the mind control conspiracy extended far beyond Nexus Corporation to include defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, technology firms, and federal agencies that had been secretly funded through black budget programs hidden from congressional oversight. But it had also revealed something that gave Jake hope for America's future. When ordinary citizens learned the truth about what was being done in their name, they demanded accountability from their elected officials and gotten it. Tommy Ricci had been awarded the department's Medal of Valor for his role in rescuing the mind control victims, and he'd used his newfound celebrity to advocate for stronger oversight of government research programs. "The thing that scares me most," Tommy had told a Senate subcommittee, "isn't that they tried to control our minds. It's that they almost succeeded because good people assumed that someone else was watching out for their freedom." Detective Sarah Rodriguez had been promoted to captain and assigned to head a new NYPD unit focused on investigating corporate crimes against citizens. Her first case had been tracking down the network of facilities and personnel that had supported Nexus Corporation's research, and her work had led to arrests and indictments across 12 states. Maria Gonzalez had won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the mind control conspiracy, and her investigative journalism had sparked a national conversation about the relationship between corporate power and individual freedom. But more importantly, her work had inspired a new generation of journalists who were committed to asking hard questions rather than simply repeating official talking points. The court proceedings had lasted 6 months, but the results had been worth the wait. Dr. Marcus Webb and 17 co-conspirators had been sentenced to federal prison terms ranging from 20 years to life without parole. Nexus Corporation had been dissolved and its assets seized to compensate victims of the mind control experiments. More importantly, Congress had passed the Mental Freedom Protection Act, which banned any form of non-consensual psychological manipulation and required public disclosure of all government-funded research into cognitive enhancement. Jake Morrison had returned to his duties as a firefighter captain, but he'd also become something he'd never expected: a symbol of American resistance to corporate tyranny. Speaking engagements at colleges and community centers had given him a platform to remind audiences that freedom required constant vigilance, and that ordinary citizens had both the right and the responsibility to hold their government accountable. "The thing I learned from fighting Nexus Corporation," Jake would tell audiences across the country, "is that the most dangerous enemies of freedom aren't foreign armies or terrorist organizations. They're the people who think they know what's best for you better than you do, and who have enough money and power to impose their vision on everyone else." But Jake's most important work had been helping the survivors of the mind control experiments rebuild their lives and recover their sense of individual identity. The Cognitive Freedom Recovery Center that he'd helped establish in Queens had become a model for similar facilities across the country, providing therapy and support for victims of psychological manipulation while conducting research into how the human mind healed from such trauma. Jennifer Walsh had become the center's most effective advocate, using her experience as a survivor to help other victims understand that recovery was possible. "They tried to erase who I was," she would tell new patients, but they couldn't destroy the part of me that knew I was worth more than whatever they wanted to make me into. That knowledge is what saved me, and it's what will save you too. The political consequences of the mind control conspiracy had been far-reaching and permanent. 3 cabinet secretaries had resigned in disgrace when their involvement in funding the research was revealed. The director of the FBI had been fired and faced criminal charges for attempting to cover up the conspiracy. Most importantly, the scandal had led to a fundamental restructuring of how government research programs were overseen and funded. But Jake understood that the real victory hadn't been the arrests or the congressional hearings or the new laws protecting mental freedom. The real victory had been the awakening of the American people to the reality that their freedom could never be taken for granted, and that the price of liberty was indeed eternal vigilance by ordinary citizens who refused to surrender their independence to anyone. Standing in his firehouse 6 months after the confrontation at Nexus Tower, Jake Morrison looked out at the streets of Queens, where he'd grown up and served for more than 2 decades. The neighborhood looked the same: working-class families, struggling to get by, small businesses owned by people who'd built them with their own hands, kids playing in streets where their grandparents had played decades earlier. But something fundamental had changed in America since the mind control conspiracy had been exposed. Citizens were asking harder questions of their elected officials, demanding transparency from corporations that wanted to influence their lives, and taking personal responsibility for protecting the freedom that previous generations had died to preserve. Tommy Ricci joined Jake on the firehouse steps, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd helped save his country from a fate worse than foreign invasion. "You know what I realized, Cap," Tommy said as he handed Jake his coffee. "The people behind Nexus Corporation made one critical mistake. They assumed that Americans had gotten too comfortable, too distracted, too lazy to fight back when someone tried to steal their freedom." Jake nodded as he sipped his coffee and watched a group of neighborhood kids playing street hockey with the same intensity that he'd brought to hockey games 40 years earlier. They forgot that this country was built by people who valued freedom more than security, independence more than comfort, and individual dignity more than collective efficiency. Those values don't disappear just because someone invents new technology or accumulates enough money to buy politicians. The radio in the firehouse crackled with a routine call. A kitchen fire in a residential apartment where someone's dinner had gotten out of hand. Jake and Tommy finished their coffee and began putting on their gear with the practiced efficiency of men who'd spent their careers responding to other people's emergencies. But as they prepared to roll out on what would be their 3rd call of the day, Jake reflected on how much his understanding of his job had evolved. For 23 years, Jake had thought his mission was simply to put out fires and save lives. But the confrontation with Nexus Corporation had taught him that sometimes the most important fires weren't visible to the naked eye. They were the slow-burning threats to human freedom that could destroy entire civilizations if they weren't detected and extinguished by people brave enough to act. As Engine 19 rolled through the streets of Queens toward another emergency call, Jake Morrison understood that his real work was just beginning. The mind control conspiracy had been defeated, but there would always be other threats to American freedom. Other powerful interests that thought they could manipulate and control ordinary citizens for their own benefit. But Jake had also learned something that gave him confidence in America's future. When the chips were down and freedom hung in the balance, ordinary Americans had proven they were still capable of extraordinary courage. A college student who'd survived mind control experiments, a detective who'd stood up to federal intimidation, a journalist who'd risked her career to tell the truth, a firefighter who'd refused to be silenced by powerful enemies. Together, They'd shown that the spirit of resistance that had founded America was alive and well in every generation. The kitchen fire was routine, grease fire that had gotten out of hand when someone tried to put it out with water instead of smothering it with baking soda. Jake and Tommy had it under control in 10 minutes, and the family whose dinner had turned into an emergency was grateful but embarrassed by all the attention. "Don't worry about it," Jake told the young mother, whose attempt at cooking dinner had filled her apartment with smoke. "We've all been there. The important thing is that you called us when you needed help, and nobody got hurt. That's what neighbors are supposed to do for each other." As they packed up their equipment and prepared to return to the firehouse, Jake reflected on the simple wisdom of what he'd just told the young mother. America worked best when people looked out for each other, asked for help when they needed it, and were willing to provide help when others needed it. The mind control conspiracy had tried to destroy those connections between citizens, turning them into isolated individuals who could be manipulated more easily. But the conspiracy had failed because Americans had ultimately chosen to trust each other rather than the corporate and government authorities who'd claimed to know what was best for them. Jennifer Walsh had trusted Jake Morrison to help her escape from Nexus Tower. Jake had trusted Tommy Ricci to get the victims to safety. Tommy had trusted Maria Gonzalez to tell their story honestly. Maria had trusted Detective Rodriguez to protect them from federal retaliation. Each act of trust had built on the previous one until a network of ordinary citizens had proven stronger than a conspiracy backed by billions of dollars and the power of federal agencies. It was a lesson that Jake hoped Americans would remember the next time their freedom was threatened by people who thought they were too powerful to be stopped. That evening, as Jake sat on his front porch in Queens, reading the newspaper account of the latest congressional hearing on government oversight of research programs, he felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition or career advancement. He'd done what his father had taught him to do. He'd stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, and he'd refused to be intimidated by bullies who thought their wealth and power made them untouchable. The newspaper article quoted Jennifer Walsh speaking to a group of college students about the importance of protecting mental freedom. "The technology exists to control what you think, how you feel, and what you believe. The only thing standing between you and that kind of control is your willingness to think for yourself and demand that others respect your right to do so." Jake folded the newspaper and looked out at the American flag that hung from his front porch, snapping gently in the evening breeze that carried the sounds of his neighborhood. Kids playing, families talking, life continuing with the comfortable normalcy that was only possible when people were free to make their own choices about how to live. Tomorrow, there would be other fires to fight, other emergencies to respond to, other threats to American freedom that would require ordinary citizens to do extraordinary things. But tonight, Jake Morrison was content to sit on his porch and appreciate the simple fact that Americans were still free to sit on their own porches and think their own thoughts without corporate or government interference. The mind control conspiracy had been defeated, but the larger battle for American freedom would continue as long as there were people who valued power more than liberty, control more than independence, and efficiency more than human dignity. Jake Morrison had learned that he had a role to play in that larger battle, but he'd also learned that he wasn't fighting alone. Across America, in cities and small towns, other ordinary citizens were standing up to corruption, demanding accountability from their leaders and refusing to surrender their freedom to anyone who thought they knew better. It was the same spirit that had founded the country, preserved the Union, and defeated fascism in 2 world wars. As long as that spirit survived in the hearts of ordinary Americans, Jake Morrison was confident that no conspiracy, no matter how well-funded or how well-connected, could permanently enslave the land of the free and the home of the brave. The story of Captain Jake Morrison and the mind control conspiracy had ended, but the story of American freedom continued with every citizen who chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and liberty over security. And in firehouses and police stations, in schools and churches, in neighborhoods and communities across the nation, ordinary Americans were writing the next chapter of that story, one act of courage at a time.